That's what I'm going with. So that's why I just made that announcement. Radio. Are we good with the webinar? Everything's good? Okay. Darryl? Mr. Chairman, are we okay to start the session? Okay. Well, thanks again to all the presenters this morning that gave us the background introduction to physical and biological characteristics of the North Pacific, from physics to forage fish. The first session of this afternoon, we're going to move into thinking about and talking about impacts of a changing ocean on marine mammals and get up to that top predator level. My name is Samantha Simmons. I'm the Scientific Program Director with the Commission, and I'll be your moderator for the afternoon session. Just a couple of reminders that we have a few new faces in the room. The meeting is being recorded, so if you do have questions to ask from the audience, if you could come to the microphone to ask those questions, and please remember to identify yourself for the record. Any other logistics? Darryl? The parking. Oh, yes. So if you did park in the hotel parking lot, there is a station just out the front here that has a validation. Please remember to pay on your way out. Once you've paid, you have 20 minutes to leave the building. Otherwise, you'll be charged over again. And if you do validate your parking, it should be $20, not $45 for the hotel rate. Okay? Okay. So we're going to have 4 presentations in this session this afternoon up until 3 p.m. before the coffee break. And the first presenter is Vera Trainer, who is Harmful Algal Bloom Team Lead at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center. She's going to tell us about domoic acid and harmful algal blooms' impacts on the ecosystem.
Thank you, Samantha, for the introduction, and thank you all for the invitation to speak here. I'm going to be talking about a particular type of harmful algal bloom that had huge impacts on the ecosystem here on the U.S. West Coast in 2015. And although the story is a little bit old, I think the impacts are not, and I'm going to hopefully get the message across to you that we will be seeing more of this. So just to draw your attention to the center of this slide, this is a zooplankton net tow sample, which usually captures only zooplankton. But this is clogged with chains of Pseudonychia, which is the diatom that can form long chains, sometimes of up to 100 cells in length. And because of these chains, it formed basically a net within a net, clogging multiple nets up and down the U.S. West Coast. And you can see here some of the field samples. They look like they're cultures, but they're not. They're field samples. There was an article in the Seattle Times in 2015 in June saying this may be the largest toxic bloom ever. And at the time, we had evidence that it spanned from basically Point Conception, California, all the way up to the Aleutian Islands. And some of the highlights here that, at least in certain locations in California, it was very long-lasting. Some of the highest toxin concentrations ever measured were found in anchovies and sardines on a NOAA cruise that was collecting these fish. And as I mentioned, there were super long chains of Pseudonychia, and the cells had very healthy chloroplasts, which was evidence of the vitality, the incredible success of this organism in a very stressful year. And the stress was caused by the warm temperatures. I don't know, did you hear from Nick Bond this morning? And he talked about the blob. So I'll just talk a little bit more about the blob. But this was one of the articles in the New York Times later that year saying that the ocean basically was a cauldron. And here it is evidenced also in the snowpack. You see here the U.S. West Coast from 2013, 14, and 15. And those of you who like to ski know it was an awful year in the ski areas in the surrounding Seattle. So a very unusual year of very low snowpack. So just to take a moment to step back. Harmful algal blooms are vectored through the food chain. They're not always visible, so at times we will see very high density blooms. In the case of the slides that I showed at the beginning, you can see colored water, but that's not always the case. These algae are filtered by either shellfish or filter-feeding fish, which are then transferred to higher levels of the food chain, either to us or the predators such as whales and other mammals that you guys are interested in. And through that process, these toxins are bioaccumulated over a period of time. Some of the toxins in the case of domoic acid it is a hydrophilic toxin, so it is washed out of the system relatively quickly. So again, we saw huge impacts, not only in the mammals, but also in transfer of the toxins to a number of shellfish. There was a lot of concern about Dungeness crab, which is a major industry here on the West Coast. And what you see here is that the landings of Dungeness crab were decreased quite substantially in 2015. About $100 million lost to this industry, which is the largest fishery actually on the U.S. West Coast. But in addition, we have Pacific razor clams, which are a really fun shellfish to dig on the coast. We have occasional openings for public shellfish digs, but then also our native tribes are dependent upon these shellfish. So they can harvest as many shellfish as they want. They keep them in their freezers, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, the concern that there may be health concerns for these folks insofar as they're consuming low levels of domoic acid over a longer period of time. So there was also a loss of income due to the restriction of harvest of these shellfish in 2015. So what do we know about domoic acid poisoning, also called amnesic shellfish poisoning, because it is affecting the glutamate receptors in the hippocampus, which is where your memory and learning takes place. So one of the significant symptoms of the poisoning is a loss of short-term memory. So there are a number of marine organisms that can be affected by these toxins or are vectors of the toxin. And in particular here, I'll point out that the sea otters are impacted because these blooms settle after a period of time from the pelagic zone into the benthos, where they're then transferred to organisms such as Amarita, a sand crab, upon which the otters can feed. So it's not just the surface of the ocean, it's at depth also where this toxin transfer can occur. So this is a summary of some of the impacts of this large bloom. As I mentioned, a closure of the razor clam fishery. The crab season was actually completely lost at the time. You see here this November 3rd San Francisco Chronicle article. It puts crab season in doubt, but in fact it was closed for almost a half a year. So sea lions, I'm sure you've heard from Francis the impacts of sea lions, but the first ever sea lion with domoic acid poisoning was found on the Washington state coast in 2015. And this was a signal to the rest of us that there was a huge bloom offshore. Anchovy and sardines health advisory was also put out in California due to high toxins. So this is a summary of what my colleague, Kathy LaFay, was able to put together for impacts on marine mammals. So in the yellow, you'll see the organisms in which at least some detectable domoic acid was measured, and in the red, those animals that had very high levels. The ring around the organism is a symbol that these animals actually had domoic acid poisoning symptoms. So up and down the coast, there were animals that either had symptoms of poisoning or had some detectable levels. Those are only the ones that could be analyzed, so you know that there were more animals affected offshore. So perhaps a summary of what Nick showed this morning. You can see basically these are summary months of the temperature anomaly. So for example, in your upper left, from January through March of 2013, you can see that these anomalously warm waters were well offshore. And then as you go down in the columns, you see that this intensified, then it moved close to shore. But in January through March, it was very close to the entire United States West Coast. And this is what we now know brought these blooms to shore, which were then able to be fueled by nutrients from upwelling. And this is just a little bit of a restful moment here to show that there were those who noticed this in the United States, and there were even cartoons about this, and the guy in the Midwest still doesn't see any global warming. Okay, so here are some data basically showing you the razor clam domoic acid. What I didn't mention is that razor clams are basically our historical record of blooms that have occurred. It takes them sometimes up to a year to release these toxins. So what we noticed in razor clams up and down the coast, and you'll see a number of sites in the map on your right, but basically on May 8th, that single date was when we had levels of toxin in razor clams above the regulatory level of 20 parts per million. And then if I draw your attention to the top, you see your north-south wind stress. Basically, when the winds are moving toward the north, we're having storms. So it was those series of 3 storms just before May 8th that brought the cells to the coast. And this is also demonstrating again where I have the words upwelling there, just around that May 8th date, where you see temperature from a series of thermistors that are on a mooring. The different colors represent different depths. That's what the Z is there. And what it's showing is when the temperature at the various thermistors, it's at a range rather than a single point. That's demonstrating that your upwelling is there at the coast. So we know now that the cells were brought to the coast and they were fueled by nutrients from upwelling, followed in the bottom panel by toxins coming to both the coast. So we saw the cells and then we saw the levels in the razor clams. So here we see a more typical year. This is about 4 hours from where you sit right here, due west. And you see data from Long Beach, which is basically right there, the beach that's north of the Columbia River, which separates Washington and Oregon. And you see on the top your total pseudonychia. Pseudonychia is the cell that can produce the toxin. And then in the blue, the razor clam domoic acid. And you see in this typical year, in the springtime, you see just about at the regulatory level some domoic acid, maybe a closure. Some years there are no closures. But in the year 2015, we saw huge levels of cells at the coast, right around the May 8th time frame, followed by toxins in razor clams. And we're asking ourselves, is this now the new normal? We were lucky to participate in a series of NOAA cruises, and these are some of the data from those cruises. On your left, you see the particulate domoic acid, so that is toxin levels in the cells themselves that are filtered onto filters and then analyzed. And you can see the months there, June, July, August, and September. And when we were on the cruises in California in June, every value that's a red value was higher than anything ever measured before. And then on the right, you actually see the cell abundances. And wherever you see a grayed out area, that's where this cell pseudonychia was dominating. So just in summary, we saw huge levels of toxin that had never been seen before, and also high numbers of the cell that can produce toxin. You see less of the domoic acid up north because by the time the cruise had was occupying the waters off Washington. It was already August, and the bloom had dissipated further north, but it was still persistent off California at that time. Okay, so what do we now know about this particular year? There were unusually warm sea surface temperatures resulting in drought and low snowpack. Ocean temperatures were greater than 3 degrees Celsius above normal. This warm water anomaly was huge. And what we believe is that nutrients became depleted within the blob, so there were very few other phytoplankton cells that could survive. We know that Pseudonychia has unique capabilities of surge uptake for nutrients, and it also has unique capabilities for trace metal acquisition. So it's going to be one of the ones that wins in the ocean when you have stressful environmental conditions. Stressful environmental conditions. So we believe that this blob was an incubator for the toxic algae, which then, when they were brought to the coast, could use their surge nutrient uptake capabilities to bloom up and down the coast. So what does this tell us about the future? Here you see on the top the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index. In the center, you see your sea surface temperature anomaly. And then on the bottom, you see your monthly maximum domoic acid. These are data actually from Oregon. And what you can see is that on the beaches, in years when we have anomalously warm waters or immediately thereafter, we see the largest of these blooms. So what we are anticipating is that as ocean waters continue to warm, we will perhaps be seeing more of these blooms. So just briefly, there was a statewide advisory for humans that are super consumers of domoic acid. There was a recent paper led by Lynn Grattan that has found that there are some problems with cognition in some of the tribal populations that are eating high numbers of these shellfish. So what made 2015 unusual? It was the spring timing of this large bloom. The simultaneous delivery of the bloom to the coast at all of the sites along the U.S. West Coast, except for the very southern part of California. The blob was an offshore incubator. Nitrogen concentrations were low in the blob, so the cells could do well only when they hit the coast. And we believe that this surge uptake capability is giving Pseudonychia an advantage. And we think, and I don't know if Nick talked about this, we've had some discussions, but he says that this is sort of our practice for what's going to happen under climate change. So what are we doing about this? We have a number of phytoplankton monitoring programs that provide some early warning of when these cells access the beach. And there's also a program in Alaska called the Southeast Alaska Tribal Toxins Partnership. This tells us basically what's at the beaches, and it's very successful in providing an early warning to coastal managers, be they state managers or some of the tribal managers. Thanks to the collaborators through the Olympic Region Harmful Algal Bloom Project and the Sound Toxins Project, these are the folks who are doing the phytoplankton monitoring on a weekly basis. And then the funding sources here, my colleagues at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, a number of managers, and also the cruise volunteers. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Vera. That's a very informative talk, and we have plenty of time for questions. So to the commissioners and committee members first, any of you guys have questions? Robin.
Yeah, I was wondering, and this may be a combined question for Francis, but with pinnipeds, of course, if the animals are debilitated or sick, a large proportion of them are coming on shore, whereas that's not the case with cetaceans necessarily, and I'm curious whether there's been discussions among folks regarding these harmful algal blooms as to, what proportion of the cetaceans that might be affected by these are actually being detected, if there's been any sort of scaling factors considered.
I'm going to let you take that one.
It's actually sort of the million-dollar question, because what domoic acid does is it binds to receptors in the brain and causes the animal to have a seizure. So if you're a pinniped and you come ashore, you can have your seizure somewhere like Pier 39 in front of a bunch of people. They see you, they take you to a rehab center, you get diagnosed. So if you're a cetacean and you have a seizure at sea, you drown. So diagnosis would depend upon somebody retrieving that carcass. The second problem is that to make a diagnosis, you actually either have to detect the toxin in the animal, in the blood, and as Vera mentioned, it's actually cleared very rapidly through the kidneys. Half-life is 4 hours. So you can imagine an animal eating a bunch of anchovies for itself. It vomits a bit, has a seizure, and by the time the animal is dead, that toxin could have been cleared. So detecting toxin isn't very reliable. And then finally, you can look at brain and you can look for lesions that are caused by the neurons firing, but that actually takes time to develop. The neuron has to die, atrophy, and then have some change you can pick up microscopically. So again, those are really hard to find in animals that die suddenly at sea. So 1998 was the first year that domoic acid was diagnosed as causing a problem in marine mammals. Since then, I think we have at least 4,000 sea lions with documented lesions and subtle effects. And to date, there are still no characterized lesions in cetaceans at all, even though there have been multiple mass drowning events that temporally and spatially coincide with domoic acid-producing blooms. For example, common dolphins in Southern California. And then I'll mention some whales in Southeast Alaska. And in those animals, there are a few individuals that had domoic acid detected in urine, so it was cleared, but still, we still managed to find some in urine. So we basically know pretty much nothing about the impact of domoic acid on cetaceans.
Although, if I may add, we do know that as far as the harmful algal blooms go, there are a number of retentive sites along the coast, which are also productive fishing grounds. So the Juan de Fuca Eddy, that's about 50 kilometers offshore at the border of U.S. and Canada. There's also Hecate Bank, which is off Newport, Oregon. These are the sites where these blooms generally initiate. So I would think that if your mammals are feeding there, they're more likely to have impacts. And if they're feeding in other places, maybe those impacts are diluted.
Randy.
Yeah, this is probably not a fair question, maybe not even a good question, but you made as a rhetorical question, I think, this statement, what are we doing about this? And because then you talked about monitoring and predicting. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering, is there anything that can be done to mitigate, moderate, reduce the severity, incidence, so forth?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think these offshore blooms and, their linkage to warm temperatures, that's going to be a harder call. I think some of these, some of the freshwater algal blooms, some of the blooms that are inshore, there is some effort to try to mitigate them. But these coastal oceanic blooms, it's going to be really tough. And we have evidence that they've been around for a long time, but they do appear to be worsening. If you start to mitigate the effects of climate change, maybe you're doing something, but that's a hard call. Yeah.
I was going to ask about, for coastal blooms, trying to minimize or alter our use of fertilizers and nitrates.
Right. Yeah, and so especially for the freshwater algal blooms, there's been some experimentation with barley straw and things like that to bring the blooms from the surface to depth and You know, there's also potentially impact on drinking water, so this is of great interest. And I think it's going to be a huge problem in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned that the monitoring stations are providing information to tribal managers and local managers. And I'm wondering also, is there a mechanism for that information to be, maybe it already is, but to be transferred to the local stranding networks? So
Yes.
as a heads
Yes.
up? Okay, cool.
Absolutely, and we have a mapping system that was requested by managers, so it's sort of like a traffic light system where you see where your high-risk areas are, and that has helped our Washington State managers prioritize their sampling sites. And I've only talked about one particular type of toxins. You have a whole menu of them. So this mapping system deals with three: domoic acid poisoning, paralytic shellfish poisoning, and diuretic shellfish poisoning. And I'd be happy to share that with you.
Very quickly, Vera. Yeah.
Oops. We had a issue with HAPs in our region with walruses. I'm not sure if you're aware of
Yes.
that, but Gay Sheffield should be listening to this conversation. But several walruses washed up that were fairly good condition, and we just wondered what caused the death. And samples were collected from 2 of our communities and shipped somewhere to, and where low levels.
I think Kathy
Yeah.
LaFay, my colleague, has been analyzing
Right.
those samples, but
Yeah.
the tribal community should not eat those digested
No.
shellfish. That's like so
That's
bad.
an
Yeah.
emerging issue that we're
Yeah.
very concerned about in our region of
Yeah.
food security, because
And-
we
right.
rely a lot on these animals for food.
Right.
So,
And I think we have to also realize that there are multiple stressors now with warmer waters. That's going to, promote the growth of bacteria and viruses as well as these harmful organisms. So I don't think we can point to harmful algal blooms for every problem, certainly.
right. The point, I guess the other point is we're trying to find funding to continue testing these samples for whatever is out there, because it's our food security.
Thank you, Vera. And our next presenter is Frances Gulland, Commissioner with the Marine Mammal Commission and Senior Scientist with the Marine Mammal Center. She's going to talk to us about recent marine mammal mortality events or unusual mortality events. Or neither.
Well, thanks, Sam. That was a great lead-in from Vera. So in talking about dead marine mammals, I think the first thing is just to run through how do we get information on dead marine mammals in U.S. waters. And one of the main sources is from stranded animals. So those are animals that wash up live or dead on the beach. So pertinent to, pinnipeds will come up when they're sick. Cetaceans usually wash up dead. We also get individual reports of carcasses on rookeries, perhaps whales dead floating at sea, whales that come in on the bows of ships to ports, or animals that are actually entangled and in fixed gear at sea. There are obviously also carcasses that are observed through the Fisheries Observer programs, and then there are animals that are harvested for subsistence reasons, and some of those are not deemed fit for human consumption for various reasons and are examined. And I think what's really important is that information and data from these different sources of dead marine mammals are not integrated in one place. So all the information on strandings, the location and where the animal was found in its species are all collected in a strandings database managed by the Marine Mammal Health and Stranding Response Program. And those, we call them level A data if they are data on just species and location, and those are public data. But then information on causes of mortality from other sources, such as carcasses. I'm looking, for example, at Tom Gillette, who runs a pinniped program. If there are people running these long-term programs on the Channel Islands and Alaska, data on those animals does not go into the stranding database. and then individual carcasses that, that maybe have died through ship strikes or entanglements, some of that information gets used in the stock assessments, but is not integrated into the stranding database. And then finally, some of the information that we have from diseases and infections that may have resulted in or could result in mortality detected through subsistence harvest are again archived in maybe either species-specific or local databases by the folks working on those animals. So it's rather scattered. Then sort of superimposed on this, there is something called the Unusual Marine Mammal Mortality Event Program. And this was established under the amendments to the Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1992. And the intent here was to have a better system for tracking marine mammal mortalities in the US, because at the time, and I would say Congress in its wisdom recognized that marine mammals could be important sentinels of ecosystem change, and we needed a way to track this information. So there is quite a structured approach to the unusual mortality event sort of process. First of all, there's actually a working group of experts, and this group will decide whether an event is unusual or not. And then they will make a recommendation to the secretaries, either of Commerce or the Interior, who will then declare that event an unusual mortality event. So it's a bureaucratic process. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a novel epidemic or epizootic. And this matters to people responding because there is a contingency fund associated with this process, and the intent of this fund was to enable people responding to treat the animals, to take samples for diagnostics, and to investigate the causes of the die-off. But the last appropriation into the contingency fund was in 2005 for $800,000. So all responses since that have been nibbling down on that fund, and it's now in the minus areas. So the definition of a UME that the working group uses, actually in the statute, is it has to be unexpected. It's unusual, and it involves a significant die-off of a marine mammal population, and it demands an immediate response and a formal investigation. I think that part is fascinating. Like, who demands it? The sea lions, Congress, the public, or the scientist? So given that, those are what UMEs are, and so officially in the US right now, there is actually only one ongoing UME along the west coast of the US. And this graph, you'll see the numbers of Guadalupe fur seal strandings along the west coast, and blue is California, and green are animals stranded in Oregon and Washington. And the red arrows indicate declarations of UMEs. So currently, there is a California stranded Guadalupe fur seal UME that was declared in 2015 and is still ongoing. Whereas actually back in 2007, there was a UME declared for Guadalupe fur seals in Oregon and Washington. So you can see this immediately demonstrates some of the challenges to this UME program is it's not really reflecting the true change in strandings over time. The unusual part of it was when the stranding network was alarmed and requested assistance, and then it was when the working group took a vote on the number of strandings was unusual compared to previous years. So that's what's happening with Guadalupe fur seals along the coast. And most of these strandings are actually of pups of the year and occurred in the spring. So here you see the seasonality with pups stranding mostly in January, February, March, really picking up in April, May, and then dropping off later in the year. Not all these Guadalupe fur seals were emaciated pups. There have been entangled animals. And in fact, amongst pinnipeds that strand along the California coast that are entangled, the Guadalupe fur seals are the most common species of pinniped to be entangled. You see from that graph, that's the percentage of animals coming into just the Marine Mammal Center. And then also amongst these Guadalupe fur seals, there are animals that had high levels of domoic acid in their feces. So you'll see the second to last column on the right is the level of domoic acid, which is way up in the thousands for an adult female, is extremely high. So even though this unusual mortality event declaration has mostly been assumed to be a result of nutritional changes affecting pups, there are animals within that are affected by these harmful algal blooms that Vera talked about. And then we have to think about how does this increase in mortality over the last 20 years really reflect what's happening with the population on the islands. So on the left is the Guadalupe fur seal population in the stock assessments, and you can see an exponential increase. And then the map just shows where the inverted comma UMEs occurred in 2007, 2009, and then 2015, 2018. So these increased numbers of Guadalupe fur seals are also mirrored in movements of these animals. So we have tracked animals that stranded during the UMEs and then were released from rehabilitation. So satellite tracking devices were fixed to those animals. So the left-hand graph left-hand figure shows the movement of those animals, and then the right-hand one shows the map of animals that were tagged on Guadalupe Island during the same period. So you can see that the animals that stranded seem to be moving further northwards up the coast, and whether that's something that is then mirrored in the stranding patterns or it's just that reflects the small sample size of individuals that were tagged, we really can't say at this point. But clearly these animals are moving way beyond Mexican waters and Guadalupe and coming up into the US. So that's really what's happening with Guadalupe's. To sort of bring us back to the blob and the oceanic conditions that we've been hearing about, there was also a UME of California sea lions declared between 2013 and 2016. And this was really primarily a result of hundreds and thousands, literally, of malnourished pups and yearlings stranding along the southern California coast. So this was really unusual for the stranding networks in Southern California to see, and so there was a huge concern about the scale of the response and the welfare of these individual pups, and that triggered a request to the working group for declaration of a UME for these sea lion pups. And again, we should put this in context of what's happening with California sea lions on the rookeries, and actually we'll hear more about this in a later presentation, so I won't steal thunder, but just to say there's lots of sea lions going around. We should also bear in mind that sea lions do strand for a number of other reasons along the west coast of the US. And this graph shows the number of California sea lions stranding since 1998, when it was first diagnosed, of domoic acid toxicosis. So numbers of sea lions that are poisoned are in the hundreds in many years. And the most severe increase in the number of strandings was in 2014, 2015, in association with the blob and the bloom that Vera documented. But we are seeing sea lions strand in every year since domoic acid was first described in 1998. And then interestingly, I don't want to just dwell on increasing mortality events, but really of note is that during the blob period, we actually saw the disappearance of a disease that we have a really good case record for. And this is leptospirosis, which is a bacterial infection that affects all mammals. And it is a bacteria that's shed in the urine of rodents and of surviving exposed mammals. And it survives very well in brackish, stagnant freshwater, but is killed in saltwater. It's not resistant to seawater salinity. And in sea lions, there have been regular outbreaks in California sea lions causing strandings and mortality since the early 1980s. And the bottom red graph here shows the number of sea lions dying from leptospirosis since it was first documented per month in the record just at the Marine Mammal Center. And then the stars are the number of animals that have antibodies to leptospira. And I'm showing you this below the total sea lion pup production on the islands. And what's fascinating is that we've been studying this disease for years. Outbreaks occurred pretty regularly every 4 to 5 years. So finally, in 2011, we actually received a nice grant from NSF to study this disease, and it disappeared. Like, it just completely disappeared in association with this warm water and the blob. And we have no decent explanation for that whatsoever. And then when the funding ran out at the end of last year, we had a few cases in 2017. So very interesting disease associated with freshwater runoff. The other unusual mortality event that was associated with the timing of the blob and some of these anomalous conditions was what we call the Alaska large whale UME. But actually, this event involved an increase in number of dead whales observed floating off Kodiak, and also 12 whales floating off British Columbia. Now, these animals were floating at sea. There were 46 whales total observed, but only one carcass was actually examined in Alaska and 8 in Canada because of the logistical difficulties associated with towing these animals ashore to actually examine them and sample them. So all we can really say is that these mortalities occurred concurrent with domoic acid and saxitoxin producing blooms, and 7 of the 8 Canadian whales had saxitoxin and domoic acid in the fluids that were tested. But the whales themselves were so decomposed that it wasn't possible to determine what lesions they had. And the final UME to mention is the what we call the Alaska pinniped UME, and this was documented between May 2011 and December 2016. And really, this wasn't an unusual event involving carcasses washing up, but hunters in Alaska and up on the North Slope noticed ice seals that had hair loss or spots and vesicles around the head. So these animals were actually alive, but they chose either not to hunt these animals, or the lesions were observed after the death and the animals weren't used for human consumption. There were also seals that were observed by some of the National Mammal Lab biologists who handling seals that had hair loss and skin ulcers. So overall, it's estimated that over 600 ice seals, bearded, ringed, and ribbon, and spotted seals, all had these lesions over this time period. And the cause has not been determined, but some of these signs are likely linked to an abnormality of the molt, so that these hairs are dead or they've got secondarily infected, but no primary pathogen has been identified. So this is one of those sort of strange changes in health of a pinniped that we, as a community, expect must be associated somehow with changes in the molt, which is presumably linked to some changes in photoperiod and exposure of the pineal that's really involved in controlling molt, but we really don't understand what's happening at the moment. I'll mention grey whales just now because we are at a public meeting, and over the past few weeks there have been a number of dead grey whales along the west coast that have commanded a lot of public attention. But so far to date in 2018, the number of stranded grey whales is not above what we'd expect for this time of the year. So on this graph, you can see the number of grey whales stranding in California, Oregon, and Washington. So really, what are our concerns about marine mammal mortality currently on the West Coast? And for the Commission and the CSA, what would I like you to worry about and to think about? And I think the first take-home message is that we really don't have a good way to integrate data from different sources. I showed you these examples of information that comes either from the Stranding Network or from the Marine Mammal Center, which is one particular stranding organization, one NGO, or from biologists in the field, or from subsistence harvest. And none of this information is in one place. There's no one-shot you can go to. And so this really gives us a poor understanding of the overall extent of mortality and how health changes are really linked with ecosystem changes. So if we want to pick up Sue's bandwagon of using marine mammals as sentinels, it's really not much good if what we find out comes later when we finally communicate amongst ourselves and say, there's really a problem with molt amongst the ice seals. Another point is that the majority of the investigations on strandings that really can delve down into pathogenesis of diseases or actual diagnostics are done either by the private sector or in partnership with academia. And there is support through the UME and Prescott grant programs, but the UME designation itself has a number of limitations associated with it. The designation is really useful for bringing resources from that contingency fund that I mentioned, but it also brings more attention to the event, and it often has helped increase collaboration locally among other interested parties. In fact, that's how I actually met Vera in 1998 was, it's like, yikes, we have all these sea lions seizuring, so let's all get together, and we had a great workshop in Monterey. But the UME designation itself is dependent upon a request from people responding in the region. So if they're unaware of the process, they don't request assistance. For the working group to actually declare something UME, specific criteria have to be met. And I think the most obvious one that's a problem is the actual wording of unusual. So as we see changes in baseline mortality, as we see increasing populations, some things aren't unusual anymore, but they certainly require a response, and they certainly cost money to investigate. So how do we cope with that, with the constraints of that system? So overall, I think my take-home message is that we really need a more integrated approach to managing data on marine mammal mortality. And also, we really have to think hard about how do we integrate those data with other ecosystem data sources if they're really going to be useful sentinels as distinct from really bandwagon or animals that we're just using to get public attention. So with that, I'll stop.
Thanks, Francis. Any questions for Francis? Looking at Robert.
Thanks, Francis. Of course, you pointed out multiple times the need to integrate data across different platforms and different projects and all of that. How does that happen? How would you suggest that occurs?
Well, first of all, I think when we actually met with senior person in NOAA, they just said, be a broken record and keep saying it. So I'm doing the broken record part. But many of us have worked on the concept, and Sam's actually been taking the lead on a concept of a marine mammal health map, which is essentially would be a data platform that information from these different data sources could all be in one place, and it could be linked to the, or it should be, or would be, or whatever the right verb is, to the integrated ocean observing system. So there's a straw man out there and a vision of how it could be done, having a web-based portal and having people who collect different types of data collaborate and submit data to it. There simply hasn't been the funding to do that, and there hasn't also really been a program office to embrace it. So the Commission's spearheaded a couple of workshops to bring people together. They're all very enthusiastic, but it doesn't sit, obviously, in anyone's sort of portfolio or 5-year vision.
And to follow up on that, is it something that NIMS has indicated any interest in, or?
Yes, and that we have many NIMS colleagues here, but NIMS itself, as you know, is a multi-headed beast. So there are stranding, there's the Marine Mammal Health and Stranding Program operated out of Office of Protected Resources. So they lead the strandings database management. But then there are also the science centers and the regional offices that have different parts of these data. And they all have different funding streams, and they have not been able to really take the leadership on the concept of the health map program. So Office of Protective Resources has done a lot, but again, don't have the personnel or the bandwidth to lead such a program. So most of the support has really come from the ocean observing system. A lot of enthusiasm there for the idea of a marine mammal health map, and they obviously mostly look at small invertebrate things and oceanographics. So the idea of something large and sexy in marine mammal is cool, but it costs money to pull those data together. Sorry, Sue wanted to.
Yeah, no, I'll just add to that. Sorry, there's a little bit more information about Health Map on the Commission's website, and in the next couple of weeks, we'll actually be posting an update on the 2 projects that are mentioned there as well. So you can check the Commission's website for further information and check back. There'll be some updates. So, Sue?
Yeah, just real quick, and following on to Daryl, I think really building these things in the regional ocean observing system areas is the way to go, with input from various other NOAA offices, not just fisheries, but OAR. Other parts of the agency can contribute to this, but I think the home is the regional ocean observing offices.
Any other questions? Robin and then Randy.
I was just going to say that there's another source of information where these types of records are getting lost, and it's not dead animals, but it's moribund animals, in particular cetaceans, where, you know, I can think of a few that I've seen over the years, and that kind of information doesn't get captured in stranding networks. It doesn't necessarily get captured anywhere. But they're obviously on their way out. So.
And
You don't have to press that one. You're all right.
oh, you don't have to press
You don't
that.
have to press
Sorry.
that one.
Yes.
Randy? Nope. Anybody else from the audience? We have another minute for questions. Yes, Jeremy, if you come to the microphone and use the microphone. Just announce who you are and your affiliation.
Jeremy Sterling with the Marine Mammal Laboratory in Seattle, Washington. What about northern fur seals in this story? I haven't heard much about them. Have they been in the stranding with respect to stranding?
I took my fur seal slide out, sorry, earlier today. So there, as far as the strandings go in, Washington, Oregon, South, we assume they're mostly northern fur seals from the Channel Islands, not the Pribilofs. But their strandings pretty much reflect the Guadalupe fur seal strandings with a almost identical pattern with an increase over time, and then more strandings in El Nino years and the blob year. And then, yes, we've actually got a paper out describing domoic acid toxicosis in northern fur seals, and it's pretty much the same as sea lions, as you'd expect. So they come ashore, they have seizures, they're dead, they have brain lesions. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Francis. I think we'll move on. We're going to change tacks a little bit now. The next two presenters are going to provide a bit of an overview and background to the marine mammal stocks and species that exist in the area of interest, Pacific Northwest, North Pacific Ocean. So first, Paul Wade, who's a research fisheries biologist with the NIMS Alaska Fisheries Science Center, is going to tell us a little bit about this from the large whale perspective.
Thank you, Sam. So I'm pinch hitting for Phil Clapham, who can't be here today. And Phil sent me a PowerPoint, and unbeknownst to Phil, I've decided to edit it. But because partly, one thing that Phil had not included was there's a lot of information that's become available with the IWC power cruises conducted on Japanese research ships that have given us a look at the distribution of large whales across the entire pelagic North Pacific. And so there's a lot of interesting information there that is coming along that I think we need to start looking at and incorporating. So I'm going to concentrate on sort of 5 species of large whales here in the North Pacific. All right. So starting with blue whales, and Phil and Yulia have looked a lot at historic catches by the Soviet Union and all those issues, so I will briefly mention those because those give some context of what we might think would be something similar to a population size that we want to see these populations get back up to. And so blue whales, the number was about 9,000 were taken. And, I was going to say one of the themes you'll see in a lot of these species is that sort of pelagic oceanic populations seem to be doing pretty well, but many of the coastal nearshore populations are doing poorly. And this is the case here for North Pacific blue whales, where they've apparently been extirpated from Japan. We have a California population of around 1,600 to 1,700 that seems to be doing okay by some metrics. The Monahan paper recently suggested that they were at carrying capacity, and you'll see why in a second. But also, I'll show you that there are other places where blue whales have just not returned. But this story is a little interesting. That this is from our stock assessment report, and the red and green lines are mark recapture estimates from the kind of data that John Kalmakidis collects. But the blue line that shows a decline is from the line transect estimates the Southwest Fisheries Science Center does. And I think John and Jay Barlow have interpreted this, that Kalmakidis also had a paper showing blue whales from the California population being seen from photo ID up in the Gulf of Alaska, and certainly the acoustic work shows them up there. And so one interpretation of this is that the mark recapture gives you the population size of how many individuals use an area, so that's stayed steady or maybe even is slightly creeping up. But the density's gone down off the west coast because the whales are starting to reoccupy Gulf of Alaska habitat that they occupied historically. So the population is more dispersed in that sense. And so that's interesting why they would be, is there something in the California habitat that's causing them to search a field, or is this just they finally discovered their historic habitat up in the Gulf of Alaska? So that's kind of a blue whale story. But I will point to the Aleutians as another area where blue whales have not come back. I've been working in the Aleutians since 2001, and I've never seen a blue whale, whereas the Actan shore whaling station there, people forget, they took 900 whales there. Not a huge number, but that was what they could access in a day trip, so that's within like 40 miles of, or 50 miles of there, and so that's another area where blue whales have just not come back. So you're going to see some really horrendous slides from the IWC power cruises, because what I've done is stitched together figures from their cruise reports, because for a lot of these species, they haven't really assimilated all the information yet. But the blue whales are all the blue dots in these three figures, and so this is a broad swath of most of the North Pacific pelagic areas, and you can see that there are blue whales out there throughout most of this region, sort of south of 55 degrees and the Aleutian Trench, but not around the Aleutians or in other places like that. So there are pelagic blue whales out there. They'll probably be able to make an abundance estimate for blue whales from these surveys. I don't see why they wouldn't, but they have not done that yet. So moving on to fin whales, the total catch here was much higher, 75,000 historically. I don't have a lot to say about fin whales. Our current status is sort of unknown, but we feel like they're abundant. We have a decent abundance estimates in many places. Alex Zerbini and I published a paper a while back showing that they were likely increasing in the Aleutians along the Alaska Peninsula area, but we're really lacking a lot of data on fin whales. But I will point out by, again, stitching together cruise reports from the IWC power cruises, here the fin whales are the red dots, that they really do seem to be quite abundant pelagically in the Gulf of Alaska and even south of the Aleutians, and also up in the Bering Sea. Again, they have not done abundance estimates from this data yet, but undoubtedly they will eventually, so those will be interesting to see. Oops, sorry, a little overlap on my slide there. Sei whales is another really interesting thing that's come out of these cruises, sort of a forgotten whale for us just because we have so few in our coastal waters, so they're sort of out of sight and out of mind. I overwrote it there by getting my slide a little messed up, but the historic catches was, I think, around 70,000, so it was nearly as many as fin whales, very abundant in the past. But the most really interesting thing that's come out of this is that from their pelagic areas on these IWC power cruises, they've got an abundance estimate of about 27,000. So there are a lot of sei whales out there pelagically, but they seem to be, and then they also have an estimate of around 5,000 in the offshore waters closer to Japan. But the coastal areas are really low. We only have an estimate of about 500, imprecise estimate off the west coast of the U.S. They seem to be extirpated in Japan, and similarly, the oceans in Bering Sea, they have not returned there, and that's what I'm going to show you. And I will point out that they are currently subject to whaling by Japan. The most recent catch last year was 134 in that western North Pacific area where they have that abundance estimate of 5,400. But we are doing an in-depth assessment of sei whales at the IWC, and Andre Punt is trying to do the modeling work, and this is a figure from a paper this year at the scientific committee, but this is a location of catches just to show you the historic distribution and trying to assign them to different proposed stocks as part of this assessment. But I want to bring your eyes' attention to all the blue dots there in the Aleutians and Bering Sea where a lot of catches took place. And then if you go over to the Gulf of Alaska, there are those pink dots up in the Gulf of Alaska. And that big black line running horizontally there is at 50 degrees north. And then if you go to where the Japanese have put together the power data for sei whales into an integrated manuscript where they did the abundance estimate, so I can actually show you a prettier picture here. And what really jumps out is that there are just no sei whales north of 50 degrees, and that's not what the historic case was. So just to jump back, look at all those catches north of 50, and now they're abundant pelagically, but just not north of 50. So there was likely a population in the Aleutians and Bering Sea, perhaps in the Gulf of Alaska, different stocks perhaps that were extirpated and just haven't come back, or alternatively, same populations, but they just haven't rediscovered their historic feeding areas that they were eliminated from. And moving on to sperm whales, Now the catch goes up 4 times, fin whales and sei whales, over 300,000, lots and lots of sperm whales. And not a lot to tell you here, but this is what the distribution of catches looked like. So sperm whales, very abundant and broad spread throughout a lot of areas in the North Pacific. And I stitched together, this is the even worse one to look at, but so this gives you, now I can say that these power cruises, they've done 7 of them. They've been going on since 2010. This is each year is each one of these different little figures. They marched across the North Pacific, and now they've gone up into the Bering Sea. They've done the shelf area, and then they're going to do the rest of the Bering Sea the next 2 years. So it is 8 years of surveys. And the one thing you can see with the sperm whales here, and in the upper left there, the white triangles are the sperm whales, not the black dots. Otherwise, it's the most dots you see in all of them. The sperm whales do seem to be fairly broadly distributed like their historic distribution that we see from catches. So they are at least occupying their whole range of habitat, it appears, but we don't have abundance estimates yet, and it's hard to get abundance estimates for deep diving whales like this from a line transect survey. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this. Humpbacks, the total catch was much lower, around 29,000. I think most of you know that we've done some recent work with that. We had the SPLASH study. I know you've all heard about that, but one of the main conclusions was Jay Barlow did an abundance estimate of about 21,000 for the entire North Pacific. And where we could make the comparisons, we got estimates of a 5 to 7% increase, so humpbacks seem to be doing pretty well, which has been evident in places like Southeast Alaska, where there are a lot of whales now. And we did a biological review at the agency, I'm sure you know, but just to remind you, we ended up with 4 distinct population segments. Humpbacks previously had been listed globally as an endangered species, but now we've got an Asia DPS that is still endangered. It's about 1,000 whales. In the biological review, we identified that there's an unknown breeding area somewhere in the Western Pacific. I can tell you about that later if you want to hear details. Another DPS in Hawaii that's at least 10,000 whales, quite abundant, and it was considered not warranted, so it was essentially delisted. There's a Mexico population that's somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000, and it was designated as threatened. And then there's a small Central American population somewhere between 400 and 700 that's listed as endangered as well. The catches here, I did want to make one point here, that if you see the bulk of the humpback catches, there was a lot off of British Columbia, but also south of the Aleutians along the Alaska Peninsula and over by Kodiak is what jumps out as where the intensity of catches were. And they have done abundance estimates from the power cruises now for humpbacks and gotten really large numbers. I wrote the numbers on there. This shows the track lines and the sightings. 4,500 for the Bering Sea and north of the Aleutians, 6,000 for south of the Aleutians and going over to Kodiak, and then 3,000 in the Gulf of Alaska. That adds up to a lot of whales. An analysis I've done from the SPLASH data using a multi-strata approach, I got numbers like 10,000 to 12,000 for the Aleutian Islands Bering Sea area, and we didn't believe them. We thought that something was going wrong with the analysis. But this power data from 7 years later seems to suggest that there really are a lot of whales out there in the Bering Sea Aleutians, but also that you see a lot of those sightings are south of the Aleutian Trench in a pelagic area that we just didn't survey well during SPLASH because we didn't have enough white ship time to really cover it well. So there are a lot of humpback whales out there. So that was one interesting thing I wanted to point to. And then I'll just quickly mention right whales, just with one slide. You know, the catch was 26,000. You all know about right whales and all that. But really, the most interesting new development that's come out was a paper at the IWC meeting this year by Luis Pastini, and I believe Amy Lang's a co-author on it. It's mostly Japanese scientists. But on their Japanese surveys, they have been encountering a lot of right whales over in the Sea of Okhotsk and along the Kamchatka Peninsula, and they have been taking biopsy samples. And they were finally able to do a genetic comparison between our Bering Sea population, where we've already published the genetics on it, and this western population of right whales. We've always assumed they were different stocks because of the large hiatus in distribution, and they confirmed that they were very genetically distinct. So it was somewhat reassuring in that sense that we've been doing the right thing considering them 2 different stocks, but now there's genetic data backing it up. And sorry, Robert, I'm going to ignore bowheads. But actually, I guess I do have time. I'm going fast here. But we all know the story is with bowheads, and that's the Arctic, and we're not supposed to be doing that. So this is This is what Phil had suggested, current and future issues. They're the fairly standard ones that we know about. Some of the major issues are, the loss of sea ice and potential shipping traffic coming across the Northwest Passage is going to produce shipping traffic coming through the Bering Sea and potential ship strikes of right whales. Those are important issues for us. And I believe later on, maybe on Thursday, you'll hear about the entanglement issues along the West Coast, particularly of humpback whales and pot fisheries, so I don't need to get into that. But since I have 2 minutes left. Because I went fast, I will take you back to one thing with the sperm whales that, well, I don't really need to go back to this slide, but I will anyways. One thing that has come up with sperm whales locally, I mean, if you look at where sperm whales are, they're quite large. But we do have, on this scale, it almost feels like a local issue, but we have had an increasing entanglement rate of sperm whales in the Gulf of Alaska sablefish longline fishery. And that led the agency to propose moving them from Category 3 to Category 2 to say, rather than infrequent bycatch, that it was occasional bycatch. And the numbers on that were, there's been 11, in the most recent 5-year period, there's been 11 entanglements. 6 of them were declared serious injuries because the whales were trailing gear. And they almost all happened either in the Kodiak district or the Cordova district. And one significant thing of why there might have been an increasing reporting rate of this is that half of the serious injuries occurred in boats smaller than 60 feet, and up until 2013, there was no observer coverage on boats smaller than 60 feet. So there might be some dynamic there of where the small boats fish that's different than the larger boats and all that. So that's an ongoing concern. But sperm whales are really difficult. Sarah Mesnick and a bunch of us published a paper on sperm whale genetics showing that California, the Eastern Tropical Pacific, and the Hawaii broad regions were 3 different genetic areas of the female breeding populations. But in that paper, we had trouble linking the high latitude males to any of those populations. And Hal Whitehead has done work in the tropical and subtropical Pacific, identifying acoustic clans of sperm whales that he thinks are genetically distinct. So population structure is quite complicated, and so this bycatch up in Alaska is all large males, so we have a problem of sort of linking them to their breeding populations. There were females and juveniles taken in the catch records, and we have actually seen females and juveniles in the Aleutian Islands in March, so they may still get up there, but it is primarily males. All right, just a quick little interlude on sperm whales, and I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you, Paul. We do still have time for a couple of questions for Paul, if anybody has some, looking at the commissioners and committee first. Randy?
Yeah, that long line catches of sperm whales, Paul, were these known or thought to be depredating sperm whales, or they just got tangled up in a long line by accident?
Yeah, depredating. They're getting hooked on the gear, and then essentially whenever it happens, the captains usually make the decision to cut the gear when the whale's hooked up because it's pulling on it, and so then the whales leave trailing the gear, and then the fishermen go and pull the rest of the long line from the other end of it. Yeah.
Dennis?
Thanks for that, Paul. Very interesting. Do you know whether the coverage of the recent power cruise in Bering Sea is sufficient to come up with a population estimate? So, because it's been 10 years since the estimate of 30 for that population.
Right whales. Our acoustic folks are going to tell you about what happened on the power cruise with right whales and the sightings they had on Thursday, I believe. I don't know if they had enough sightings to actually do a line transect estimate, but I will tell you an interesting little anecdote. I mean, it's only 30 whales is what I estimated in a paper from both genetic and photo ID marker capture. But previous to that, we did some tagging of North Pacific right whales that you might remember. And we tagged 2 whales in 2004. And both of those whales were seen last summer on the power cruise. So that was satisfying to me that they're still alive 15 years later. So that was really interesting information. But probably not enough information for an abundance estimate there, yeah. But you'll hear more about that on Thursday.
One quick question from the audience, if there is one. Scott.
Scott Baker, Oregon State University. Paul, that demarcation for the sei whale is so dramatic. I wonder if is there any evidence of the Japanese falsifying the records in some way that is using sei whales as a proxy for some other species north of 50?
You mean for the catch data, that all those catches were actually something else? That's a good question to ask. I would have thought that Phil and Yulia would have stumbled onto that a little bit if that was there, but that would be, sorry, I can't answer that. That would be a question for them, but it's worth considering because it is so dramatic. I would say anecdotally, I've had people tell me that they've seen sei whales in Alaska, and I had an experience on a whale watching boat out of Homer going out in Cook Inlet where we saw some whales, and the naturalist on board was telling me they were sei whales, and they were actually juvenile fin whales. So I think that there's a problem there that some of these reports in Alaska of sei whales are actually juvenile fin whales, and that yeah, it's unclear to me whether we really do have sei whales anywhere near coastally in Alaska, because I haven't seen one, but I could be proven wrong.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for the questions. We'll move on. And Tom Gillette, who is the Alaska Ecosystems Program Lead at the NIMS Alaska Fisheries Science Center, is going to give us a similar rundown for pinnipeds now. And we're on the wrong slide. There we go.
Thank you, Sam. Well, as Sam mentioned, I lead the Alaska Ecosystem Program. So when I was asked to talk about pinnipeds in the North Pacific, I had to remind myself that there was a couple other species that you might want to hear about. So I was able to gather a few slides that I've thrown in here together. I just listed the members of both my program and Bob DeLong's program. Bob gave me 2 or 3 slides to show. So just really quick to remind you in regard to stellar sea lions, we have 2 stocks, and the western stock is considered endangered right now. The eastern stock was delisted in 2013. The dotted line there notes the boundary of the 2 stocks, and of course, let's get this cursor over here. Sorry. I'll mention a little bit about this area right here, the Gulf of Alaska, that we were talking about earlier today and that I want to bring your attention to, but that's considered the western stock also. Probably still worth noting, though, sorry, I can't not mention in regards to Alaska that we're still dealing with an endangered stock out here, and we've had a pretty strong decline, but as you'll see here, we have had some increases in recent years. In 2017, we surveyed the eastern portion of the range of stellars in Alaska. We try to split the survey every other year. We're not able to cover the entire state in one particular year, and so we covered southeast Alaska, the Gulf into sort of the eastern Aleutian Islands, the Shumagon Islands, during last year's flight, and then this year we'll cover the rest of the Aleutian Islands. This is some of the data from last year. I'm sorry, this is the trend from 2002 until 2017. And what you see on the left is the non-pup trend for the last 15 years. And as you can see, it has been increasing about a little over 2% annually for non-pups in the western stock as a whole. Pups are a little bit less. And it's a little bit lower. When we reported in 2015, we had a report come out that listed a little bit higher rate of increase. And the reason for that is right here, where we see a drop. This is pups. Non-pups also dropped a little bit, but we did see a drop in abundance overall in 2017. And the reason was what we found in the Gulf of Alaska. And as you can see, this is for pups. I'll show you the non-pups in a moment. They're not quite as dramatic. But what we saw for pups was that in that eastern Gulf area, which is essentially Prince William Sound, that we had about a 33% decline in pup abundance. This is last summer. And then in the central Gulf, just to the west of that, which does include Kodiak Island and the rookeries around there, we had about a 17% decline. Interestingly, we also saw about a 6% decline in pup abundance in southeast Alaska. And for the first time, there's a rookery at the very northern portion of southeast Graves Rocks, which is a relatively new rookery. Pups were first seen there in about 1992, I believe. But this was the first time we saw a decline in pups at Graves Rock also. if you look at the non-pups, so everybody else essentially, we did see a decline in non-pups in the Eastern Gulf also, but we saw an increase in the Central Gulf. And for the most part, and we've seen this before in surveys, we believe that those non-pups were probably just moving across, but it wasn't enough to account for the differences, and certainly not in the pups. So we did see a decline overall in that Gulf region. And likewise in Southeast, the non-pup numbers went down. If you continue off to the west, the Western Gulf numbers actually were about the same in terms of the normal increase that we've seen overall for the entire population. So, you know, of course, the question we had was what was going on, and I think this morning's talks were a good lead-in for the point that I want to make. I think this figure actually came from Nick Bond, and you see I added a little bit that there was some rapid communication within our center in regard to what was going on. These 4 panels just show the sea surface temperature between 2014, 15, 16, and 17. And as you can see, sort of that warm water blob continued up through the Gulf of Alaska and all the way up. So there it is. This is 2014. And it continued up in the Gulf. It did start to break down a bit, but what we started to see was what we think was related to the blob in 2017. This, again, is a figure you saw earlier in the talk, and it gives you an idea of what was going on in the deeper water. So that, the deep water temperatures obviously were continuing to increase over time, and 2017 is on the far right. That's January of 2017. This would have been about the period of time when those females would have been carrying the pups, or the pups that we didn't see in the summer of 2017. So just to give you an idea that even though that blob was continuing moving north through the Gulf, there was still quite a bit of warm water and deep warm water. I think Nick mentioned that it was unprecedented intensity and duration this morning. So here's an article from the Seattle Times back in November, and it's alluding to some work that Steve Barbeau from the Alaska Fisheries Science Center did in regard to Pacific cod. And also we heard about this morning, the decline in abundance and biomass of cod in the Gulf of Alaska, and that they linked this to the warm water temperatures. And that middle paragraph, I think, is telling in regard to what the temperatures do. That Steve felt that it not only sped up, sorry, I make you read it and then I move the slide, that the temperatures sped up not only the rate at which the young cod were actually burning calories, but it reduced their ability to find food. And so, of course, we had this sort of hole in the age class as you go up through the years, because this was in 2014 and 15 that this was occurring. And he noted again, as we've heard earlier, a 7-degree Fahrenheit increase in some of the surface waters in the Gulf of Alaska. So here's some of the abundance information on cod for those years, and you can see the red arrow on the far right. That's the 2017 catch data. This is biomass. And what you see is a 78% reduction in the catch quota based on a 58% reduction in biomass between 2015 and 2017. So a huge drop in Pacific cod. Now, why is this important to sea lions? The figure on the left is essentially the same, although it's abundance of fish instead of biomass. But the figure on the right shows you some of the winter diet information that we have for stellar sea lions in the Gulf of Alaska. I don't have the years here, but I think it's about 2002 to 2012. And it just shows the diversity of the diet. This comes from scat samples, from hard parts and scat samples. And you see just under about 50% of the winter diet of stellar sea lions in the Gulf is Pacific cod. Pollock is also a relatively high amount of the diet. So we do think that there's probably some relationship in regards to the abundance of sea lion pups in 2017 and the availability perhaps of one of their main prey items. So quickly I want to move through. This is some information on stellar sea lions in British Columbia. I completely stole this information from a publication Peter Lisiak came out with just a few months ago to give you an idea of what's going on in Canada. And as you can see, there's been an increase in non-pups and pups between 1971 and 2013, 3 to 4.5% or so. The most recent survey was 2013, and that's what he's reporting on in this recent publication. and he's estimating the population in British Columbia is somewhere around 33,000 sea lions. I wanted to say a little bit about northern fur seals. I wasn't able to take out all my fur seal slides like Francis was, but just to give you an idea that we do have these different stocks of northern fur seals. There are two stocks, of course, in the United States, the U.S. Eastern Pacific, which includes the Pribilof Islands, the Bogoslav Island, and then the California stock. And the eastern stock remains depleted under the MMPA. There's quite a bit of variation in some of these trends. That just shows you the different stocks. And then what we've seen is in population abundance, the primary area that we've seen decreases in northern fur seals are in the Pribilof Islands, especially St. Paul Island. I won't say much more about that other than to show you this figure, which plots those two islands in the Pribilofs. They're on different scales because of the sizes. St. Paul is in red and St. George is in blue. And you can see our last survey was in 2016. We'll be doing another one this summer. But we've seen about a 4% decrease over time for St. Paul, and the pup production dropped about a little over 8.5% between 2014 and 2016 overall for those two islands. St. Paul was down 12%, but St. George actually came up. I want to show a short animation, and the reason to show this, do I need to get out of this? Oh, I know. Yeah, I'm there. Thank you. One reason to show this is a compilation put together by an oceanographer working with us, Noel Pelland, and it's essentially all of the northern fur seals that we've put satellite tags on over the years since 1991. We can see the years there, but this is all age classes. So you're going to see a yearly cycle of dots moving from the Bering Sea into the North Pacific and back as some of the tags are lost. And unfortunately, we don't have audio because there is music to go along with this, but you can just watch it. But there's different colors here, and you'll see the time scale at the top in July. So the black dots are animals from St. Paul Island, the orange dots are St. George, and then the red dots are Bogoslav Island and the Aleutians. So here we are in the summer, and they're foraging in the Bering Sea, and they're all mixing around in there. But if you were to look at this really closely, you'd see some unique foraging areas during the summer for each one of these islands. The lines that are moving are just the sea surface temperature as the water cools. And now coming into the fall, these animals begin to go into the North Pacific, which is why I wanted to mention it here to make sure everybody remembers that Alaska fur seals do go into the North Pacific. And as you can see, we're well into December now, and they're going into the Gulf of Alaska and all the way over to the West Coast. Some still do remain in the Bering Sea, of course, some around the Aleutian passes and so on into the winter and all the way down sometimes into the transition zone. And then some of the dots will obviously be blipping off as either the tag fails or the animal fails. And now we're into the springtime. They're still foraging down there. They're obviously mixing even with the California coast animals, the San Miguel animals, and so on. And then as springtime comes and the water starts to warm a bit, you'll start to see some of these dots head back through the Aleutian chain towards their pupping grounds in the Pribilofs and Bogoslav Island. And of course, there's less and less dots as the tags wear off. But here we are in July, and the few animals that are still on the air are heading back into the chain. You can see the red dots back at Bogoslav and the black dots back at St. Paul. Let's see, a couple more dots here. Yeah, the music's really nice, but sorry, you don't have it. A few more slides Bob DeLong passed along to me in regards to California sea lions. The figure's a little bit small to see, but it essentially just shows the abundance of sea lions. Jeff Lake and others just published a paper recently that's on the bottom left there of California sea lions and noted the population growth over the last 38 years or so, up to 2014. And as you can see, the population was starting to level off, and then we had that UME that Francis was talking about, which he notes over here, and that he linked that, of course, to these unusual oceanographic conditions, or the blob, and the pup strains in 2013 and all. So essentially, the population of California sea lions was increasing, and it then dropped with those UMEs, but is now starting to climb back. And he's expecting to do a surveyed this summer. They've seen exceptionally high growth since 2017. The stellar sea lions in the California coast area, you can see the abundance trend on the bottom left there for stellars, and they'll be doing another survival estimate coming through 2019. Wanted to note that there's a new rookery on Carroll Island off the Washington coast. Pups started showing up there a few years ago, but there were about 133 pups born there last year. So that's a relatively new and growing rookery. California stock and northern fur seals. Of course, they breed on San Miguel as well as the Farallon Islands. They were established in about 1964. What I think is the most interesting is the bottom left there, or I'm sorry, the bottom right, the Farallon Islands, where we now have over 1,000 northern fur seal pups that they've come back. So there were no pups seen there until about 2002, since the removal of pups during the last century. Guadalupe fur seal, really quick, approximately 20,000 animals was the last abundance estimate, as Francis noted, and they are slowly increasing and spreading. They seem to follow a similar trend to some of the San Miguel sea lions in terms of the responses to El Nino. There are 2 or 3 pups now born on San Miguel Island, and they do hybridize with the California sea lions. Northern elephant seal, Mark Lowry sent me this figure the other day. This is a manuscript he just published in 2014. He's seen about a 3.8% increase in abundance of northern elephant seals between 1988 and 2010. So he's estimating the total U.S. and Mexican population between 210 and 239,000 animals, and you can see the different trends for the areas. That's all I have. Thank you.
We do have, yeah. We do have about 5 minutes for questions. If anybody has questions for Tom, CCSA, Jason?
I think it might be of interest to comment on your last slide there. It's a good chunk of the Eastern Pacific stock.
I didn't put that there just for you, but I appreciate it. So what Jason's referring to, this slide shows Bogoslav Island in the Bering Sea. I took out all those because it was Bering Sea, but basically Bogoslav is a fur seal rookery in the Aleutians where we've seen an incredible increase in abundance of northern fur seals. It's a very small island in the Aleutians. The last census was in about 2015, I think. I think we had almost 28,000 pups were estimated at Bogoslav. However, in December of 2016, the island, which is also a volcano, began to erupt, and erupted quite frequently. I think there was probably 70 eruptions between December and August of last year. This is a picture that actually Paul took on a cruise last summer. This is about as close as we were allowed to get to it. No, I'm sorry, Dave Withrow took this one from the air, but we have some other ones. I guess I could show it if I have it. Sorry, now that you asked. There's some pictures also. But what's really interesting is that, so this island continued to erupt all the way through the summer pupping season for both northern fur seals and stellar sea lions. And although it's really difficult to see in this slide, on the bottom left you can see that there are a lot of animals on that island. This was the day after an eruption and the day before another eruption, and you can see the steam. So there were quite a few fur seals and sea lions on the island. This was on July 4th, so some of those pups were still quite small. So we don't have any idea. Well, we have some ideas, but we don't know what this means for abundance for both of those species. We haven't been back to the island. We were hoping to get there this summer, but we won't, but Fish and Wildlife Service will be there. And so maybe we'll get some information on what's going on with fur seals. Yeah.
Any other questions for Tom? Randy?
Yeah, just a quick question about the Western Pacific stellar sea lions. You didn't mention if they're going up, down, or staying the same. How are they doing?
They so the Western Aleutian, are you referring to, or the whole Western stock?
Yeah, real Western Pacific. I mean, Russia.
Oh, I do have that too. I just took it out because I didn't think you wanted that. Let me get back to my. I just want to see all the slides because it's at the end. Can you go down a little bit more? Keep going. Can you click on that? So there's Russia here. These numbers I just got last week. And so this shows the overall trend for stellar sea lions, non-pups in the Russian Far East between 2002 and 2017. So there's been a somewhat steady decline. And what we see is that just in those last couple of years, I highlighted the Kuril Islands. That's where we've seen really the only significant decline in stellars in Russia, the Kurils. And Vladimir Burkhanov did these surveys and documented a pretty steep drop just last year. The biggest increase is actually the Sea of Okhotsk. All the way north in the Sea of Okhotsk at Yamsky Island and Ioni Island, we've seen increases. So that's what's called the Sakhalin region there on the bottom left, where we've seen a blip come up. The Commanders, which of course is just west of the Western Aleutian Islands, has kind of gone up and down, but actually the pup numbers have increased in the last few surveys a little bit.
Okay, and it is actually time for Francis. That button you need to press. Do.
So like the contrasting populations of the northern fur seals and the pribiloves and all our California pinnipeds, are there differences in fecundity or trends in pup birth weights that give some insight into what's happening?
I don't think we have any of that, certainly not fecundity. I mean, what we know for the little bit of work we looked at a reproductive rate on the pribiloves on St. Paul a number of years ago, you remember, that Ward Testa published paper where he used ultrasound to look at it, and he couldn't document any difference in terms of sort of the percent of the number of females pregnant in that fall before the winter migration. So that's mostly compared to historical accounts for the pribiloves, though. So, but you're talking about comparisons to California? Yeah, not that I know of. I haven't seen anything like that. No.
Okay, and we are now into coffee break time, so please join me in thanking all four of our presenters here again. And if you do have additional questions for them, please try and grab them over the coffee break. We will reconvene at 3:30, where we're going to have a very interesting session on emerging tools and technologies. So hope to see you all back here at 3:30. Thank you guys very much. Appreciate it. Thanks, Tom. And are you guys okay if I publish, if we post those presentations as they were on the website? It'll be pretty